Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have lobotomies. Did you know that it used to be common practice for people to just get a part of their brain cut out? Okay, well maybe not common, but it wasn't as uncommon as you would hope. Lobotomies used to be considered an excellent and efficient cure for things such as mental health problems, which thankfully is a practice that has not survived for a very good reason. Of course, in modern medicine they do still exist, but only when actually necessary, and there is of course a lot more knowledge about the dangers and effects. One well-known person to have undergone one of these procedures was Rosemary Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's sister. She was experiencing seizures as well as mood swings, and while the seizures certainly were something that needed to be looked after for her health, I'm not sure if the mood swings necessarily needed some kind of medical intervention. Anyways, to cure her, they had a lobotomy performed on her. This procedure left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, and she could no longer speak or walk properly. After this, she spent most of the rest of her life hidden away, and it was thought that her family did this because they were ashamed of her, which is both horrible and so sad. In our number 9 spot today, we have the English Civil War. This might be something that is taught more often in English schools, but admittedly it's something I didn't even hear mentioned throughout my time in school. This was actually a series of civil wars that took place between 1642 and 1651, and while it is often referred to as one event, it can be divided into 3 separate wars. These wars were mostly in relation to the manner of England's governance as well as pertaining to religious freedoms. The first war was from 1642 to 1646, and the second was from 1648 to 1649. Both the first and second wars saw supporters of King Charles I battling against supporters of the Long Parliament. The third war took place from 1649 until 1651, and this one saw the supporters of King Charles II fighting against the supporters of the Rump Parliament. In the end, these wars saw the execution of King Charles I, the exile of his son King Charles II, and the replacement of the English monarchy with the Commonwealth of England. There's so much more information about what went on and who was fighting in these wars, but I unfortunately don't have time to cover all of it in the short amount of time we have, but it certainly was a revolutionary period for England, Scotland, and Ireland, and it really was concerned with how these 3 kingdoms should be governed. In our number 8 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. This one is a bit more well known than some of the others on this list today, but I want to specifically talk about one thing in reference to this that is much less well known. In 1807, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that this was obviously because of the wine-only diet, but that's not actually true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer. Truthfully, who knows, but I suppose in a very roundabout way he did still kind of die from this wine-only diet. In our number 7 spot today, we have the World War II dogs. A lot of us have learned quite a bit about World War II as it affected everyone at the time and was obviously a huge deal. We all have slightly different perspectives on it depending where you grew up and went to school, but it's something that is still widely talked about today. There is so much to cover on this topic, so of course some of it ends up getting left out of the history textbooks, but that doesn't mean the knowledge doesn't survive in some capacity. For today's list, I want to talk about a technique that was used in Russia during World War II that ended up completely backfiring. In Russia, they had trained dogs with bombs strapped onto their backs to run under tanks. I'd like to think that this technique also saw the dog being able to leave the bomb there so that they could escape, but that is most likely wishful thinking, but that isn't even what I wanted to talk about today. While this is, I suppose, a good tactic for fighting a war, there was one grave oversight during this training. All the dogs were of course trained using Russian tanks, since that's where and who they were being trained by, so when it came time for the real deal, these dogs couldn't differentiate between a Russian tank or an enemy tank, which then saw the dogs running under what they knew, which were the Russian tanks. Certainly not the outcome that they were expecting. In our number 6 spot today, we have Mary Shelley. We all know Mary Shelley as the author of Frankenstein, but there's one super creepy and kind of sad thing about her that is much less well known. Mary Mary's husband was a man named Percy, and when he was 29 years old he was sailing with 2 other men, and on July 8th, 1822 they got caught up in a storm and ended up drowning. The bodies of the men were found 10 days later, and they were only able to be identified based on their clothing. This of course is extremely tragic and sad, and of course it would have been so awful for Mary to have to lose her husband at all, let alone in this way. Percy ended up being cremated, and for some reason his heart was the only part of his body that refused to burn, which I guess now physicians suggest was due to calcification from an earlier bout with tuberculosis. While this in itself is pretty freaky, at first Percy's friend Lee Hunter ended up keeping his heart, but later it was turned over to Mary. Instead of disposing of the heart or doing anything normal with it, Mary ended up keeping the heart, and she carried it with her for years. No one knew about this odd little keepsake until a year after her death, when it was found in the drawer of her desk, wrapped up in the pages of one of his last poems. What a simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful, but also ultra creepy story. The heart ended up being buried in the family vault with Percy and Mary's son after he passed away in 1889. In our number 5 spot today we have strange medicine. It's not necessarily uncommon for us to hear about strange things that people in the past used to do, but sometimes those strange things are also disgusting. It was extremely common in the past for people to use human remains as a form of medicine. You'd think at some point they'd realize that these remains truly were doing more harm than good. Well, I guess we did, but it did go on for much longer than it should have. The cannibalistic treatments would consist of things such as blood, ground up human skull, and even human fat. Tomb raiders would even steal remains in order for them to be sold to the wealthy, which is incredibly dark, and apparently mummy remains were the ideal remains for these sorts of things, which led to a shortage of mummies. I never thought I'd be in a position where I'd be talking about a shortage of mummies, but truly anything can happen over here at Most Amazing Top 10. I guess who am I to judge these past decisions, but all I can say is that I am very glad this is one we have moved on from. In our number 4 spot today we have the Chilean Civil War. Just to throw another war into the mix today, let's talk about the Chilean Civil War of 1891. The short of it on this war is that the president at the time, Jose Manuel Balmaceda, tried to give himself a lot more power than he probably should have had. The Congress weren't exactly thrilled about that, so they and the Chilean Navy rebelled against the president and the army. The Navy made the smart move by going north and seizing the nitrate mines, which were very economically important. From there they sailed south. Like any war, there of course was a lot that went on, but ultimately the Navy and Congress were successful and victorious. This war was actually the first war where modern torpedoes were used and were actually successful, although it took all of the torpedoes they had in just one attack. Part of the reason the Navy was so successful in this war because not only were they able to dominate on land, but also sea. This really led other countries to realize how vital it was for them to have modern ships and naval defenses. It also made other countries realize how important it was for them to have modern weapons. This war may be lesser known and less discussed, but it certainly was an eye-opener for a lot of other countries. In our number 3 spot today we have King Gojien of Yue. King Gojien of Yue had his reign from 496 BC until 465 BC. His reign took place during what was arguably the last major conflict of the spring and autumn period, and he was able to lead his state to victory, but it certainly wasn't an easy road or without some very creepy happenings. The major conflict he led his state through was the war between Wu and Yue, which started when a Yue princess, who was married to a prince of Wu, left her husband and fled back to Yue. I mean, this of course wasn't the only thing that caused the war, but it certainly sparked the fire. King Gojien was an extremely humble king, as he wouldn't relish in the riches he had as most royals would. Instead, he ate the same food as peasants and often would leave himself hungry in order to remember that he was in a position to serve his state. Okay, so you might be sitting there wondering when I'm going to get to the scary historical event that you came to this video for, so here it is. As I mentioned before, he was able to lead his state to victory, but of course a war involves a lot of sacrifice and some pretty horrific happenings. King Gojien's army was very well known for their ability to scare their enemies before battle began, and this is because their frontline consisted of criminals who had been sentenced to death. In this time there wasn't lethal injection or the electric chair, so naturally it was a lot more of a vicious process. These criminals would decapitate themselves in front of the enemy army. Yep, I I think this is probably the definition of a scary historical event. I can't even imagine witnessing something like that and then having to proceed with a battle against the army that has people doing that sort of thing. King Gojian was certainly not a leader who was wasting time messing around. In our number 2 spot today we have Topsy the elephant. Topsy was a female Asian elephant who was born in Southeast Asia around 1875. She was secretly brought into the United States shortly after and was unfortunately added to a circus who advertised her as the first elephant born in the US, despite that obviously not being true. During her 25 years with this circus, she gained a reputation as a bad elephant, and after she ended up killing a guest at the circus, she was sold to Coney Island's Sea Lion Park in 1902. The Sea Lion Park was eventually sold and renamed to Luna Park, and during Topsy's time here, she was involved in quite a few highly publicized incidents, which could be attributed to her drunken handler, the publicity-hungry owners of the circus, as well as the fact that this is all a perfect example of why animals that belong in the wild should be in the wild. In the end, all of the horrible people who had a hand in Topsy being in this circus decided that since she was such a problem, they would execute her publicly. They were going to hang her, but because people thought that that was inhumane, they decided to take a different route. For the record, I just want to say that the execution of Topsy was inhumane no matter what method they chose, because Topsy didn't deserve to be in this kind of an environment. On January 4th of 1903, Topsy was fed carrots that were laced with potassium cyanide, and she was also electrocuted and strangled. To make this horrific day even worse, the event was both spectated and the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company was there to film the whole thing. Many people believe Thomas Edison was actually there himself, but that is something that is up for debate. This whole situation is absolutely heartbreaking, and Topsy deserved a lot better than everything she had to go through. In our number 1 spot today we have the Red Summer. The Red Summer is something I didn't even hear mentioned in school, which is honestly absolutely shocking. I'm hoping this is something that is more commonly taught than I think it is, because it certainly is very important. The Red Summer is the term used to refer to the period from the late winter through to the early autumn of 1919, in which white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in more than 3 dozen cities across America. Some of the more well-known race riots that took place during the Red Summer were the Chicago and Washington, D.C. riots, and the Red Summer also saw the Elaine massacre that took place in Elaine, Arkansas, which saw the deaths of between 100 to 240 black Americans. These anti-black riots are said to have developed from a multitude of post-World War I tensions, such as the economic slump and the competition in job and housing markets. In 1919, it certainly wasn't uncommon for there to be race riots and a multitude of white on black violence, but the Red Summer really marked some of the first race riots in which black people in number stood up to the white supremacy, resisted, and fought back. During the Red Summer, a civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph publicly defended the right of black people to self-defense. It is said that between January 1st and September 14th of 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 black Americans, but despite this, the states refused to interfere or prosecute these mobs. Considering how many race riots went on during this summer, we truly could dedicate an entire video to the Red Summer. It is insane to think about how recent 1919 really was, and while we certainly have come a long way, there is always more work to be done, and part of the work involves us learning about these horrible histories and what happened in our past. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the Rhode Island vampire. Admittedly, witch and vampire hunts aren't exactly a topic covered in most history classes, but this is truly a pretty crazy story. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was spreading pretty rapidly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. This obviously would have been pretty terrifying for the residents of these places, but things quickly took a very dark turn. Since many of the people who were passing away from this illness appeared very obviously ill with sunken, drained faces, for some reason, the logical response was that people believed that they had been the prey of vampires. There was a family in Exeter, Rhode Island that had multiple people pass away from the illness, so some people believed that someone in this family must be the feeding vampire. They even went as far as to exhume the bodies of some of the deceased family members to make sure that they weren't undead. One of the exhumed bodies had passed away more recently, so her body was in better condition, which people of course took as a sign of her being a vampire. This led to them burning her heart and liver, and then they mixed the ashes with water. This is most definitely a crime today and pretty scary, but to make things even worse, they gave this concoction to other people in the town who had fallen ill as some kind of a cure. Imagine having to drink that and then still having tuberculosis after. Definitely not a good trade-off. In our number 9 spot today, we have India in World War II. It would be shocking to hear of a school not teaching anything about World War II, but it's often that we don't truly get the full scope of what went on. One thing I saw brought up a few times was the role that India played in the war and what they went through. Firstly, if you didn't know, India played a huge part in the Second World War. We normally hear of the large death tolls from the war, such as the 418,000 Americans who died, or the 450,000 people from the UK, which, don't get me wrong, is a huge and terrible number. But it is estimated that 3 million Indian people died in World War II, which is something I have literally never heard of anyone talk about before. India was fighting Japan, which for the record also had an extremely high death toll in this war, on the Eastern Front, and they were fighting Germany on the Western. World War II is a part of our global history, so why don't we talk about it and how it affected all of the countries? In our number 8 spot today, we have the Acadian expulsion. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far. This is something that happened in my own country, you guys, and I can honestly say this was never taught at the schools I attended. The Acadians were descendants of the 17th and 18th century French settlers who settled in the area that is now the Canadian Maritimes, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. In 1730, Acadians had to swear to British authorities that they would remain neutral on any conflict between Britain and France. Basically, one thing led to another, and the governor of Nova Scotia at the time, Charles Lawrence, saw the Acadians as some kind of a threat, and he also wondered why people who weren't from the area were allowed to live on such a beautiful part of the land. Well, isn't that real rich coming from someone who also wasn't from the area? But that is a whole separate conversation. Charles tried to force the Acadians to take an unqualified oath of allegiance to Britain, and when they refused, he imprisoned them and then ordered them to be deported. A man from New England called Charles Morris came up with the disgusting idea to surround the Acadian churches on a Sunday morning and capture as many people as possible while also burning their houses and crops. This whole situation led to approximately 10,000 Acadians being deported, and apparently this whole ordeal had a fatality rate of 53% for the Acadians. This whole thing is honestly pretty disgraceful, and it's just something that we don't talk about. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Iranian Revolution of 1979. On August 19th, 1978, at the Cinema Rex in Abadan, Iran, there were hundreds of people watching a film when 4 men barricaded the doors, doused the cinema in gasoline, and lit the whole thing ablaze. This was a key event that led to the following revolution of 1979, but it truthfully had been building for quite some time, and this obviously wasn't the only event that led to this movement. This revolution was unique in the fact that it lacked a lot of the usual causes, such as a defeat in war, or a gigantic national debt, or an uprising of those in poverty. There is a lot that happened and a lot that went into this revolution, and I truly do not have time to cover in this video even half of it. But this revolution not only toppled Iran's absolute monarch, but it had worldwide political repercussions that are still seen today. In our number 6 spot today, we have Cyrus the Great. It is entirely possible that you may have learned about Cyrus the Great in school, as he was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, but there is one thing he did that apparently a lot of us didn't know that possibly changed the course of our history. After he took Babylon over, he freed all of the captured slaves in the city and let them go back to their homelands. This included the Hebrews who were captured and enslaved from Judea. This may seem like a nice and reasonable thing to do, but it truly was more than that. By allowing these people to be free and return to their homes and continue practicing their religions, this may have been what has kept some religions alive. Without this move, it is possible that we may not have Judaism, Christianity, or Islam today, and that would have made our entire history very, very different. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't widely talked about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin or banana medicine back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that a person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Some people's noses and lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would sadly pass away from the disease. So basically what we think of as a beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing, but also very scary, and like pretty close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have the history of dentures. I suppose this one is less of an event and more of a weird practice, but I just had to include it. I don't have a ton of experience with dentures, but they seem to be a pretty straightforward thing these days, aside from the cost of dental, but things weren't always the way they are today. Instead of dentures being made of fake teeth, before, they used to be made with real human teeth, which is absolutely disgusting to me. After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers went and took the teeth off of the corpses, which is quite a job, and then they sold these teeth to dentists. These dentists would boil the teeth, chop the roots off, and then attach these teeth to ivory base plates and then sell them to the customers. Aside from this being an extremely morally questionable practice in its entirety, it is also just so creepy. In our number 3 spot today, we have telephone cats. If you're a cat person, you might want to skip over this number. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order to test how auditory nerves perceive sounds. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about this is truly messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out a part of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and then the other end to a telephone receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were, of course, benefits to this experiment, and it is believed that this may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is, of course, an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life like it truly deserved, these scientists instead decided to kill it to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 2 spot today, we have the smallpox pandemic. I'm sure at some point or another, most of us learned about smallpox and the epidemic, which is something that we luckily don't really have to worry about much anymore. But one thing a lot of people explained that they didn't know was how badly it devastated indigenous peoples. Europeans who came over to America brought with them a multitude of diseases that they would have had some immunity to, considering it was likely their bodies had encountered it before. But this was not the case for those already living on the land that is now referred to as North America. Indigenous Americans not only had no immunity towards this disease, but also their traditional ways of treating illness may have only exacerbated the symptoms. Because of course, how could you possibly know how to treat something that you've never seen before and with no help from the people who actually do know? It has been estimated that the spread of this disease caused the population of Indigenous Americans to decline by 70%. That is absolutely insane. There's a theory that this spread of disease may have been one of the only things that led to the colonization of North America. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Tulsa Massacre. This is one that many people, including people from Tulsa, explained that they didn't really learn much about in school. This event occurred on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, and it has actually been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. This happened in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and basically just mobs of white racist people went out and attacked black residents and businesses. What started this was when a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland was accused of harming a 17-year-old white girl, and he was subsequently arrested, and there were rumors that he was going to be lynched. This of course drew a bunch of racist white people out of their homes to participate, but then a group of around 75 black men also showed up to make sure that he didn't get lynched. One thing led to another, and a firefight fight broke out that led to 10 of the white people and 2 of the black people being killed. After this, all hell broke loose. Just last year, the last living survivor of the massacre, R&B and jazz saxophonist Hal Singer, passed away at the age of 100. And just last year, this massacre finally became a part of the Oklahoma State curriculum, and it's about time. Only a century too late. I also feel like in that I didn't include, but I should have said, that thing after the lynching was like only the beginning of it, and then everything got crazy and way more people died, and it was really destructive. I just didn't want anyone to think that I was making it seem like it wasn't as bad as it was, because it really was. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Heraclitus of Ephesus. Heraclitus of Ephesus was an ancient Greek philosopher who helped push the notion that the universe is in constant change, as well as the unity of opposites, where the universe is a system of balanced exchanges. This is all fine and well, but where things get troublesome is in his own personal life. Heraclitus was a misanthrope, and his dislike for humankind led him to having long stretches where he was quite isolated. He would wander through the wilderness alone, surviving on plants and other things that he could scavenge. In the end, he came down with a pretty terrible and painful illness called dropsy, which is an accumulation of fluid underneath the skin. Doctors were unfortunately unable to help him, so he took matters into his own hands. He decided to cover himself in cow dung under the belief that as it dried, it would draw the moisture out from under his skin. This could have been a genius idea, albeit super gross, but things took a very dark turn. Covered in the dung, he laid out in the sun to dry, but the dung created a body cast and it left him unable to move. This inability to move also left him unable to shoo off the pack of wild dogs that ended up surrounding him. So, unfortunately, he was eaten alive. I guess I can understand why this one may have just been left out of history class. In our number 9 spot today, we have Kurt Gödel. The Austrian-American philosopher and mathematician Kurt Gödel lived from 1906 to 1978, and he made quite a name for himself. Being compared to the likes of Aristotle and Einstein, he is best known for his incompleteness theorem, which was a very significant mathematical result. He was obviously very successful and found himself teaching and educating a younger generation, but similar to who we just talked about, his personal life is where things got quite dark. When he was 6 years old, he had a case of rheumatic fever which left him quite ill for the rest of his childhood. This led him to first being pretty preoccupied with his health, and unfortunately this turned into hypochondria, which then led him down a path of complete paranoia. He ended up having an irrational fear of getting poisoned, so to avoid this he would only eat food that had been prepared by his wife, who also had to taste it beforehand. Sadly, his wife was hospitalized in 1977 for 6 months, which obviously left her unable to prepare food for him. I'm not exactly sure why he couldn't just prepare the food himself, but during this period he refused to eat, which eventually led to him starving to death. In our number 8 spot today, we have prohibition poisoning. I'm sure most of us learned about the prohibition at some point in school, which of course was the outlaw of the consumption of alcohol, which was done with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol by the US government from 1920 to 1933, but it is just as well known that this ban certainly did not stop people from producing or consuming alcohol. It was just done in sneakier ways. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing that is definitely less well known is something that government agencies did to curb the black market sales of alcohol. Basically, they poisoned the industrial alcohol that was being repurposed for drinking. And not just poisoned in a way where the drinker would get sick, which is already horrendous enough, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time the prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials. In our number 7 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on, over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up nights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people, but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was very obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, But one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean he was totally abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances bricked up. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422. In our number 6 spot today, we have the sticky bomb. Okay, so this one is less of an event and more of just a historical invention that absolutely should not have existed, and that is the sticky bomb. After the British hurriedly evacuated France in 1940, they were facing the threat of German invasion and had to come up with some weapons that could be used against tanks. Thus, the sticky grenade or sticky bomb was born. It was formerly called the anti-tank hand grenade number 74, and basically the design was that there was a metal outer shell that covered a bomb coated in adhesive. The idea was to have the user pull a pin to remove the metal casing, where they could then run up to a tank, use the sticky adhesive to stick it to the tank, activate the 5-second fuse, and get the heck out of there, or you could just throw it and hope it stuck. Well, there's a few problems with this design. The first one being that I'm sure all of us can understand, the adhesive didn't want to stick to anything dusty or wet or muddy, which are all things that happen to be common to tanks. You know what they did like to stick to though? Human skin. Unfortunately, this invention could prove much more detrimental to the person who was attempting to use it. Despite these very obvious and dangerous flaws, it was still used by a few different armed forces, but I don't think anyone has used it in recent history, which is truthfully for the best. In our number 5 spot today, we have Bikini Island. Bikini Island is located within the Marshall Islands, and it once was the home of around 170 islanders. In 1940, the US president at the time, Harry Truman, ordered that the military test their nuclear weapons in the case of a future where they would be deemed necessary, since World War II had just ended and people were of course feeling very concerned about what the future would hold. Since Bikini was located in a place where ships and planes didn't normally travel very close to, unfortunately it was the spot chosen for this testing site. The residents of the island were asked to vacate for the good of all mankind and to end all world wars, to which they of course obliged, under the impression that they would one day be able to move back. After this, the testing began, and in 1954, the US military detonated Castle Bravo, which is one of the most powerful weapons at 15 megatons. There were 22 other weapons that were detonated on this island as well, so it's safe to say that this place got a ton of nuclear activity, which left it with extremely high levels of radiation. This left residents unable to return for much longer than anticipated, with the first returning in the 70s. But of course, shortly after these poor people moved back, they realized that the island still had totally unsafe levels of radiation, making it still unfit to live on, which has left it still uninhabited. In our number 4 spot today, we have Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a deputy to the ruler of the Mali Empire, but when the ruler went missing while on a sea voyage to find the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, Mansa Musa became the ruler in 1312. During his rule, European nations were really struggling due to civil wars and a lack of resources, but the Mali Empire was flourishing because of their abundance of resources like gold and salt. Under his rule, the empire grew to take up a large portion of West Africa as he conquered 24 cities and their surrounding districts. At the time, Mali was one of the top producers of gold in the entire world, which left Mansa Musa as one of the wealthiest historical figures ever. One of the most well-known events during his rule was his pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey took place from 1324 to 1325, and it spanned an estimated 4,000 miles, and it was the first time people outside of the empire saw just how wealthy he was. He traveled with 60,000 of his men, all wearing Persian silk, along with 12,000 slaves who each carried 4 pounds of gold bars, and he brought heralds who had golden staffs, along with a bunch of camels and horses. This pilgrimage had a profound effect on Egypt as this huge group of people passed through. From the markets in Cairo to the royals to the impoverished people that crossed their path, Musa left Cairo littered with so much gold that it depreciated the value of the metal in Egypt, and it took decades for them to recover. That was kind of just a whole mess. But like, we talk about like Napoleon and Alexander the Great and all the things that they did, and I've literally never heard of this guy before. And he's like one of the best conquerors, most successful conquerors of all time. seems suspicious. In our number 3 spot today, we have the hostage crisis. In 1980, America saw Ronald Reagan win the presidential election over the former president, Jimmy Carter, but there was a crisis going on that was taking the attention of Americans everywhere. The Iran hostage crisis is well known in American history, and it began on November 4th, 1979, when 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage after a group of militarized Iranian college students took over the US Embassy in Tehran. The 444 days these Americans were held hostage is something I'm sure a lot of Americans learned about at some point or another, but the release of the hostages is what sometimes gets a little more murky in the history books. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, which was the day that Reagan was inaugurated. There were people who believed that the hostages were released because Reagan was simply just more powerful than Jimmy Carter. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that Reagan received a ton of credit for the release of the hostages, but truthfully, it barely had anything to do with him. The Carter administration had been attempting to negotiate with them for months, but they hated Carter because he had provided aid to the former monarch of Iran and had also failed an attempt to rescue the hostages before. So while they certainly were released on Inauguration Day, it had way less to do with Ronald Reagan and way more to do with them just absolutely hating Jimmy Carter. In our number 2 spot today, we have internment camps. This is something that might be more well known than I think it is, but in my Canadian education, it wasn't something we talked about at all, which is kind of shocking. During World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which would cause 117,000 Japanese Americans to have to give up their homes, jobs, and businesses and move to internment camps. This was due to the fear of espionage after Pearl Harbor. This was truly one of the worst violations of civil rights in the 20th century, and the government didn't apologize for it until decades later, but they cited national security as the justification for their actions. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning as other countries began to follow suit, with Canada, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina all having their own versions of this same kind of atrocity. It is very surprising to me that this is something that isn't discussed more often, as it of course is something that would prove detrimental to the Japanese American community for decades to come. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. New York City's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911 was an unbelievably terrible incident that led to changes being made for factory workers in America. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of a building in Greenwich Village, and it of course was where shirtwaists were made, which we would now call a woman's blouse. I call this place a factory, but it was definitely more like a sweatshop, and the employees were mostly comprised of young women. So, like I mentioned before, in 1911 there was unfortunately a fire that broke out on the 8th floor, and because of the cramped and unsafe working conditions, the fire ended up claiming the lives of 146 people that day, which is absolutely horrible. After more details came out about the incident and how the terrible working conditions were mostly to blame for the amount of lives that were lost, protests broke out all around the city. People began demanding better for the women who had to work in these kinds of places. Like, just as an example, the doors to the stairwells and exits were locked so that employees couldn't take unauthorized breaks. How unbelievable is that? And the worst part is that the owners of the company, who were largely responsible for what happened that day, basically got off scot-free. If you want to know more about this fateful day, the amazing podcast My Favorite Murder by Georgia Hardstark and Karen Kilgariff has an episode that does a wonderful job covering it. The episode is number 189, entitled What Wonderful Luck. It is crazy, and there's a lot going on. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have bees. A lot of us know bees as pretty harmless and are kind of cute little pollinators, unless of course you're allergic or terrified. But truthfully, bees normally do a lot more good than harm. That was, of course, until an experiment in the 1970s went awry and caused a new crossbred bee. This experiment was to take a regular honeybee and breed it with a bee that is found in Africa that produces a lot more honey. And of course, the goal was to produce a manageable bee that would also be able to provide more honey than a regular honeybee. Well, the bees that came out were a lot less manageable, and they didn't even make more honey. After this experiment ended, however, the bees got out into the environment, and the 80s saw the beginning of the trouble. The bees are not only aggressive towards other kinds of bees, which creates a huge problem, but they are also very aggressive towards humans. And when these bees sting, their stinger stays with them so they can sting multiple times. Victims of these swarms receive 10 times as many stings as regular swarms. They react to disturbances 10 times faster, and they will also chase the disturbance a quarter of a mile. Imagine. These bees have actually caused at least 1,000 deaths, so it's safe to say that this is one experiment gone horribly wrong. In our number 9 spot today we have lions. In the 1980s at the Chatbir Zoo in Chandigarh, India, they started an experimental program where they would breed together a domestic lion, which is a bit smaller and has less of a shaggy mane, with an African lion in the hopes that they could be introduced to the wild and help with the dwindling population of wild lions in India. The zoo found 2 African lions that were being used in a circus and brought them in to breed with their 2 Asiatic lions. When the cubs were born, it was clear that this was already a mistake, as the cubs all had severely weak back legs. They were having extreme trouble walking, and as they got older their immune systems started to fail. By 2000 they had bred more than 70 of these hybrid lions, and they finally decided to stop the program, and all the males were given vasectomies in order to stop any reproduction. There are laws that prohibit them from killing animals, so they were simply just waiting for them to die naturally. When there's a dwindling population of lions, it's insane to me that they wasted 20 years trying to do this when they could have just simply bred the lions that they did have. In our number 8 spot today we have the human Z. One of the most contentious and ethically charged endeavors pursued by Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, an extremely controversial Russian biologist, was his endeavor to produce a hybrid offspring between humans and apes. The goal actually was to create a superhuman soldier for military purposes, and as early as 1910 Ivanov presented his concept of achieving such a feat through the means of artificial insemination during the World Congress of Zoologists in Graz, Austria. In the 1920s, Ivanov embarked on a series of experiments aimed at creating a human-ape hybrid in French Guinea. 3 female chimpanzees were selected as potential surrogate mothers, and the experiment began. However, despite his efforts, Ivanov was unable to achieve a successful pregnancy and bring about the desired hybrid offspring. Thank God. Upon his return to the Soviet Union in 1929, Ivanov sought to organize a new set of experiments involving the use of non-human ape seminal fluid and human volunteers. What human would volunteer for that? I don't know, and I don't want to know. However, these plans were met with setbacks, notably the demise of his last remaining orangutan, which delayed the commencement of the proposed endeavors. Ivanov's pursuit of creating a human-ape hybrid was met with considerable controversy and skepticism. Fair enough. The scientific community was divided, with many dismissing his ideas as unfeasible and scientifically dubious. Nevertheless, his experiments reflect a dark chapter in the history of crossbreeding experiments, highlighting the extreme lengths some scientists were willing to go to in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, even if it meant transgressing the boundaries of ethical conduct. In our number 7 spot today we have the zonkey. Another one of the strange and unsettling experiments from Ivanov involved the creation of hybrid offspring known as zonkies, or zebrases, by crossing female zebras with donkeys. This experiment aimed to explore the possibilities of interbreeding between closely related species and were conducted during the early 20th century. The goal was to create a hybrid offspring that would exhibit a mix of characteristics from both zebra and donkey parents. These experiments were actually somewhat successful, leading to the birth of several zonkies. The resulting zonkies possessed traits from both species, with physical characteristics resembling a combination of zebras and donkeys. They often displayed striped markings on their bodies, similar to those found on zebras of course, and zonkies typically retained the zebra's body shape as well, while inheriting certain donkey features such as a long ear and tuft tails. It's very cute. While these experiments achieved some success in producing hybrid offspring, they did face ethical concerns and criticism due to the manipulation of animal genetics for experimental purposes. In our number 6 spot today we have lions, tigers, and ligers. Crossbreeding experiments between lions and tigers have resulted in the creation of hybrid offspring known as ligers and tigons. Ligers are the result of breeding a male lion with a female tiger, while tigons are the offspring of a male tiger and a female lion. However, while these hybrids have been successful in terms of producing viable offspring, They raise significant concerns and have been regarded as ethically problematic. The primary issue with lion-tiger hybrids is related to their health and welfare. Ligers, in particular, often suffer from various health problems. Their large size, resulting from the combination of their parent species, puts a strain on their bodies, leading to skeletal and organ abnormalities. Ligers also have a higher likelihood of experiencing reproductive issues and shortened lifespans compared to their parent species. Additionally, these crossbreeding experiments are typically carried out for entertainment or commercial purposes, aiming to produce exotic and visually striking animals for display. This has raised ethical concerns about the welfare of the animals involved, as such breeding practices often prioritize profit and human fascination over the well-being of the hybrids. Moreover, these hybrid experiments highlight the blurred boundaries between species and the potential negative consequences of manipulating nature for human curiosity and amusement. While ligers and tigons may attract attention due to their very unique appearances, the ethical implications and potential harm to the animals involved have led to widespread criticism of such crossbreeding practices. In our number 5 spot today, we have the farm cattle. In the 1990s, farmers in India were told that if they crossbred their cattle, they'd be able to breed cattle that could produce more milk, which would of course mean more money for them and their families. This should be amazing and great, right? Well, considering why we're all here today, I think we know the answer to that. Different breeds of bulls were brought in and farmers were expecting great things, but they ended up being stuck with cattle that did produce more milk, but also needed way more higher quality food, or else they'd stop producing more milk. And they were also less resistant to the local diseases, so they required more veterinary visits as well. So it's kind of like this situation of, yes, they are producing more milk, which will get us more money, but they also cost us more, and truthfully, most of the times the increased milk production did not outweigh the growing costs. In our number 4 spot today, we have the wolfen. Wish I never had to say the word wolfen, but unfortunately, they do exist. These guys are created when a female common bottlenose dolphin is bred with a male false killer whale. They are extremely rare and have been found in the wild, but unfortunately, most of the ones that have existed were bred in captivity. The first recorded wolfen was born at the Tokyo SeaWorld in 1981, and he very sadly died just 200 days later. Probably a prime example of why maybe they shouldn't really exist in the first place. The first that was born in the United States that actually miraculously survived was at a sea life park in Hawaii in May of 1985, and her name is Kikemalu. She ended up having 3 babies. The first passed away after a few days, the second passed away at the age of 9, but thankfully the third one is still living. The most recent update I could find seems to state that at this point, both mother and her daughter are still alive, but unfortunately they remain in captivity. In our number 3 spot today, we have the beefalo. Okay. Beefalo sounds kind of cute and silly. It also looks pretty normal. So what could be wrong with this one? Well, let's start at the beginning. A guy named Charles Buffalo Jones started breeding them in 1906 because the bison population in Arizona at the time was exceptionally low. So bison were bred with domestic cattle in order to produce a hardy commercial animal. He ended up just giving up on this and released the animals, who were then managed by the state, and the numbers remained relatively low because of the limited hunting licenses. Well, when the beefalo found their way into a national park where hunting is banned and there aren't any natural predators, the population began to grow by 50% a year. That's wild. So none of this is necessarily bad, but it's the animal's environmental impact that is the real trouble. First off, they're very thirsty animals and can consume 10 gallons each per trip to a watering hole, so they can obviously clear up a water source pretty quickly. Not to mention the fact that they do their business in the water and how their heavy weight compacts the soil. Basically, they have totally thrown the ecosystem off balance and have pushed out other animals, and the insects and plant life around have also been affected. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Pyrenean ibex. The Pyrenean ibex is an animal that went extinct around 2000 in a horrible turn of events. The last one was a female named Celia, and she was killed in an awful falling tree incident. These animals were native to the Pyrenees Mountains on the border of Spain Spain and France. Back in the medieval ages, their population was reduced drastically to an endangered level. This is due to two things: being hunted, as well as the spread of human disease. Flash forward to 2003, however, and scientists tried to bring them back to life. This is the first extinct creature that scientists ever tried to clone. That is absolutely crazy, and it actually worked for 7 minutes only. DNA from Celia, the last living individual of the species, was taken and implanted into the womb of a domestic goat. From here, the clone was in fact born, but due to lung complications was unable to survive for longer than 7 minutes. It was a short life, but a monumental one that definitely broke new ground in the scientific world. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the human pig experiment. Back in 2017, researchers at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies achieved a significant milestone by producing the first ever human pig chimera, as reported in the journal Cell. The team used cells from an adult human to create stem cells, which were then injected into early-stage pig embryos. These embryos were implanted into female pigs and allowed to develop for several weeks. Approximately 1 in every 100,000 cells in the later stage pig embryos was derived from humans. In this human pig experiment, the researchers encountered trial and error in finding human stem cells that developed in alignment with the pig's embryo's timeline. The ultimate goal of such research is to potentially grow human organs within pigs for transplantation, addressing the shortage of donor organs. While this study raises possibilities for life-saving organ transplants, critics argue that mixing human and animal elements crosses ethical boundaries. The National Institutes of Health in the United States has prohibited federal funding for human chimera research, although there have been indications of potential relaxation under careful monitoring. The research opens up opportunities and ethical questions, but fears of creating half-human, half-animal chimeras are not applicable to this study. The next challenge for the researchers is to improve efficiency and guide the human cells to form specific organs within the pig hosts.
Starting us off at number 10 is the Judas cradle. The medieval times are known for a lot of stuff, and one of those is their insanely gruesome torture devices. Back then, if you'd found out you were facing the guillotine, you could actually breathe a sigh of relief, because trust me, there were far worse ways to die. One of these horrific devices was called a Judas cradle, and was used to interrogate prospective criminals into talking, and often would result in their death one way or another. Victims that faced this torture would be stripped of their clothing, bound, and then lowered slowly onto a pyramid-shaped spike that, depending on your downstairs parts, would be aimed at different areas, I'll just say. Any movement at all would only make the pain worse, so if you weren't telling them what they wanted to hear, they would often rock the victim back and forth, tearing them further open, and they would keep victims here as long as it took, sometimes even overnight. But what about the death part? Well, if you didn't die from injuries received during the torture, or frankly just blood loss, then most died from infection. You see, the spike was never really cleaned, so there was a whole horde of bacteria and disease that would settle onto the spike, inevitably seeping into the victim's nether regions. How fun, right? Next up at number 9 is cruentation. The Middle Ages had many interesting ways to handle justice, much of which I think we are all incredibly grateful is illegal nowadays. One of these such practices was called cruentation. Essentially, back then they believed that corpses retained a tiny spark of life after death, and so they were therefore revered as magical entities. Just imagining that they saw rigor mortis and decided that the corpse was somehow still alive. But how did this involve their judicial system? Well, with the idea of using the corpse's magical powers to their advantage, they would place an accused killer in contact with the corpse of their alleged victim. And if the corpse started spontaneously bleeding when the convict was in its presence, it was seen as confirmed evidence that they were guilty of the crime. This actually remained a completely legal practice until the late 17th century, but thankfully somewhere down the line they figured out that maybe a dead bleeding body couldn't be used as proof to convict someone of killing. Next up at number 8 is slug soup. Listen, I love just about all the creatures on the planet, and I don't have it out for slugs or anything, but I have never been able to look at one without feeling nauseous, so this actually actually sounds like a personal version of hell to me. During the Crusade battles, Muslims became popular for using aconite to poison the Crusaders. This was obviously causing quite an issue, as at the time there was no known cure. That was until one day when 14th century doctor Guido de Vigevano noticed some slugs munching away on an aconite leaf, and he had the biggest light bulb moment of his career. He collected slugs and boiled them before using the boiled sludge and turning it into a soup. First he tested it on animals, and after successful results there, he decided to try it out for himself. After a bit of trial and error, it turned out to make quite a successful antidote to the poison. But man, oh man, does it sound incredibly disgusting. But still, better than being poisoned, I guess. Coming in at number 7 are transy tombs. In the Middle Ages, the practice of memento mori, meaning remember you must die, was huge. Memento mori was practiced in many ways: open caskets, churches filled with skeletons of the dead, and years later developed into things like photographing the dead. Their keen attachment to this philosophy likely stemmed from the sheer amount of people dying so frequently due to the overall lack of hygiene, so they had to come to terms with death in a much more peaceful sense than maybe we do now. One of their favorite ways to practice memento mori, however, was with transy tombs, which were funerary monuments that depicted the deceased in a stage of eerie decomposition. As you can imagine, they were costly, so usually they could only be resurrected after those with high standing or a small fortune in the bank. At the time, there was an existing belief that the earthly body was merely a transition vessel of the soul, and that after death the spirit would be resurrected. And so in creating these tombs that resembled the decomposing dead, they figured it would help the soul move on more quickly. And while I'm not opposed to all of the reasons behind it, from the modern lens, it is a bit morbid to have statues not only resembling the dead, but looking like zombies lining the streets, and I'm just glad this practice went out of fashion. Coming in at number 6 is bloodletting. Back in the day, the medical practice of bloodletting was used by medieval physicians as they believed it would literally let the bad blood out of the body. This belief is mostly derived from the Greek physician Hippocrates and his theory of the 4 humors. The 4 humoral theory centered around the belief that inside the body there are 4 main humors or liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, and that any imbalance in these liquids was what caused health issues or even changes in temperament. So where bloodletting came in was that there was this belief you could let out blood in order to balance out these liquids in your body again. Now, while this theory was definitely a stepping stone in modern medicine, many argue could be considered a precursor to blood transfusions, the way that it was being done was without any real scientific backing, and without any understanding of just how much blood was safe to let out or from what vein or artery was the safest. For example, people were so into the practice at the time that they would base which day was best for bloodletting on texts, usually advising to pick a saint's day. It was also popular to rely on charts showing which parts of the body were best to bleed from according to their zodiac. So as you can imagine, the practice did not always end well. Coming in at number 5 is Saint Francesca Romana. During medieval times, fornication in any other context than between a man and his wife and for the purposes of procreation was considered a sin, punishable by life in prison. Now, of course, there were many people that did not take this to heart, but there was one woman who very much did: Francesca Romana. For as long as Romana could recall, she always wanted to become a nun when she got older, but as happened all too frequently back then, her father forced her into marriage at the age of 13 as the man in question was extremely wealthy. At first she was incredibly reluctant, but after she allegedly received a vision from Saint Alexis, she changed her tune and became a dutiful wife, and even perhaps grew to like her husband. But this didn't change Romana's belief about the sins revolving what went on in the marital bed, so in private, wishing to remain spiritually chaste even if she couldn't be in her physical body, she would heat pork fat and burn her nether regions to ensure that she would remain in extreme pain throughout the act and never enjoy a minute of it. This was the only way she believed she could commit the act without sin and remain in the good graces with God. Coming in at number 4 is an arthritis cure. This one actually blew my mind when I first came across it. According to an 1896 news story in the Smithsonian, one day a drunk man was on a beach with some of his friends when he spotted a rotting whale carcass. Because he was drunk, he thought it'd be super funny to dive right into it. And he did. His friends waited for him and finally he came out, but he reported something incredibly strange. That his rheumatoid arthritis was seemingly gone. This sparked a national craze in Australia, and once word got out about the healing powers of the whale carcass, the town of Eden became a worldwide destination for people suffering from the condition. Visitors would be lowered into a freshly dead whale through a hole which would be sewn up, and it was advertised that if the person could stay inside for 20 to 30 hours, they would be cured of their pain. I have to imagine that you would need to be in so much pain to give this a try in the first place, because the thought of spending an entire day inside of a dead whale just seems wild. That being said, it's not all a bunch of hogwash. There is reason to believe that the rotting whale would have acted like a sweat box of sorts, potentially relieving some of the pain, but truthfully I don't see how this could cause any kind of permanent fix. Let's just be grateful there are some other options out there today. Coming in at number 3 is a brutal execution. As has already been established, one of medieval Europe's most notorious strengths was figuring out the most gruesome way to either torture or kill their citizens. And if you thought that the Judas cradle was bad, then wait until you hear about this one. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a method of execution far worse than any other. At least with practices like the guillotine, it's over quickly enough, but with this one it was quite literally drawn out just to make you suffer. First off, the victim would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged, or drawn, behind a horse to their place of execution. Second, they would be hanged until the point right before they died. Then they would mutilate the body, often by disembowelment or emasculating it, while they were still alive before finally beheading them and quartering the body, meaning cutting it into 4 pieces. It was intentionally excessive, as this was a punishment saved for those who committed high treason against the king and was used to instill compliance and fear in the onlookers. It was most popular in 14th century England, although it remained in the rotation of choices until it was abolished in 1870. Coming in at number 2 are changelings. Across Europe there was an old belief in changelings, which were thought to be evil creatures left in place of young ones stolen by fairies. This was a huge problem for many reasons. Number 1, it was objectively not happening. You see, the main reason that parents believed their little ones had been swapped with a changeling was that their young ones suddenly fell ill, had physical deformities, behavioral changes like advanced knowledge beyond their years, or being mischievous. So essentially, if the young person in question got sick, became intelligent, had a disability, or acted like a normal developing person in any way, it was viewed as a changeling. Tragically, once it was believed that a changeling imposter was in their arms, there was only one way to handle the situation: hurt it in hopes that the fairies would come save the changeling and they would give their real one back. They did things like exorcisms, leaving them in the cold, poisoning them, or even trying to end their lives. And they believed that in doing this, their real little one would be returned to them. It may just be one of the saddest and most cruel practices to have ever existed. And last up, in our number 1 spot, are Ivy League photos. If you thought there was corruption in the high-ranking areas of society before this, then buckle up, because this one might be one of the most insane things I've ever heard. Apparently, for some time, it was actually required for students enrolling in Ivy League schools to have their photos taken in a grotesquely inappropriate fashion. To put it delicately, you are not allowed to be dressed. This dark underbelly came to light in the 1970s when a Yale employee opened a long locked room and discovered thousands of photos dating back several decades. It was then uncovered that between the 40s to the 60s, it was a requirement to submit what they called posture photos, which were taken from every single angle and forced the subjects to attach pins to their spines under the guise of studying their spines. Some schools, however, practiced longer. Harvard, for example, began in the 1880s and got away with it until the 20th century. Of course, there was a huge investigation about this, and they found that the photos were used in various studies for big tobacco, or that they would use them in books for illustrations, but the creepiest was a professor that admitted the photos were used for anthropological research and were used to study the connection between a student's body type and their intelligence, in what was basically glorified eugenics. Thankfully, most of these photos have since been burned. However, for some reason there are some that remain at the Smithsonian. I'm just grateful the practice of mandatory nude photos is banned, cause actually what the heck is that?